raise that bar.
That extra gear, the first 3 steps.
Huge strides in the performance.
That I might not be the player I am today.
All right, welcome to another episode of Behind the Gear, and we have the lucky privilege of sitting down with another gentleman with a great set of hair, just like I've got. So two very, very blessed guys who don't have to get haircuts very often and don't need shampoo. There you go. All right, there you go. Full disclosure. We got Sean Fitz-Gerald with us, and Sean, I really appreciate you coming on. As we were kind of talking a little bit before we got on, I'd heard you speak on a couple different platforms, and I was really, really intrigued at I want to talk a little bit about your background stuff as well, but just about your book that came out, and we'll get into that a bunch. But first of all, how are you doing? How's everything going? How's life been in this weird year that we've had?
Yeah, we're in Toronto. So Toronto, we have 2 kids who are aged 9 and 6, and they're both in hockey. One, this was going to be his first year in the Greater Toronto Hockey League. The youngest was his second year of learning to play, just one level below sort of house league. So they've both been shut down since early to mid-November, so no ice at all. Not even 8 kids on the ice. It's just been completely shut down. And in Toronto, we do have the outdoor sort of artificial ice rinks, but Toronto being Toronto, it's so crowded that you have to sign up on the city portal on the website for a 45-minute slot, and they're open for registration 7 days in advance. And if you're not on, 3 seconds after 8 o'clock that morning, you're not going to get a slot. So it's been interesting, but I mean, part of this, I think that 10 years from now, we're going to have a conversation, and lots of minor hockey families will have seen this as the winter that they did other stuff, that they just maybe didn't even pick up a hockey stick. This is something that could turn into be a net benefit for lots of kids for lots of reasons.
Well, I think I've got an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old, so very similar to your two. And you as a mother father family, you kind of figure out other things. Like I've never hiked so much in my life, or gone for walks, or different things like that. So you kind of find other kind of outlets. And one thing too with Toronto that's a little bit unique. I know anybody from the south thinks, oh, you live in Canada, it's frozen, you live in igloos, there's ice everywhere. But Toronto's kind of one of those climates that's 50-50 on building an ice rink in your backyard. You may get enough cold weather, but is it going to sustain? You may get, is it worth putting the time and effort in putting your own outdoor rink? Now, a lot of the city rinks that are open, like you said, that are outdoor, a lot of them are piped. They got a little bit of piping underneath them so they can, withstand kind of a +2, +3, +4 weather. But it's so, being able to just throw an outdoor rink in your backyard would be awesome, but it's, climate wise, it's a little bit tough sometimes.
Yeah, no, we have a couple of friends who have thrown in sort of backyard rinks. And I mean, the last couple of weeks, they've been able to get out there and I mean, they look beautiful, and the pictures make you kind of wistful and lazy because you didn't do anything like that. But, after next week, it's supposed to be cold again next week. Like, the temperature here could creep above 0. And if it's sunny and above 0, like you got a nice little swimming pool back there. Yeah. So it's really tough. Some people have started going. You mentioned hikes. We have a surprisingly good trail system here in Toronto. And in those trails are a lot of creeks. And, you can go in and it looks like a Tim Hortons commercial that you go into these creeks and they're frozen and you'll see people playing shinny on the creeks, which I can say confidently, I'm not sure you would have seen that before the pandemic.
Sure. Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. I 100% agree. There's been even tobogganing and stuff. Like there's, hills that, you wouldn't even like dream of tobogganing down or sliding down that are full of people just getting outside and trying to do something. Right. So it's everyone's trying to do their best to kind of keep active and keep outside and do their thing for sure. But a little bit about you, Sean, you've obviously been in journalism for years, and I mean, covered everything from like the NBA, the NFL, the Olympics, the NHL. I mean, whole gamut of stuff. What do you have one area of what you do that you kind of gravitate to, that you love doing, or are you open? Because you've done, I mean, if anyone looks you up, you've done articles on everything when it comes to sport. So is there any avenue that you really kind of enjoy, or anything that you're into?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I love, and we haven't, because, The Athletic was a startup when I joined it almost 5 years ago. We haven't moved there yet, but one thing I love more than anything is elite amateur sport. So the Olympics. I've been lucky enough to get to 2 Olympics, 2012 in London and 2014 in Sochi. I've done, a couple of Pan American Games here in Toronto in 2015 and Guadalajara in 2011. It's just amazing because you talk about, competing for the game itself and improving on yourself, physical literacy, confidence, not necessarily. I mean, certainly you have an end goal and you have personal bests that you want to reach, but also having a life outside that sport. And I think that you see that in amateur sports in Canada more than you might in hockey. Whereas in hockey, from the age, if you're in AAA, you have people driving you to practice, you have carpools, you have, people organizing practices for you, getting equipment for you. And then when you get to certainly junior hockey, you have people who sharpen your skates, you have, physical therapists covered by the team, you have all of these things. But if you're Canada's best modern pentathlete, you're still competing for a chance to go on the world stage. But, to pay for your training, you might be a university student who has to take on extra shifts as a TA and use that money towards training. You might have to, be at U of T, and instead of getting into the pool to practice on your own, you join as an extra on the U of T swim team. Like, it's more well-rounded in a lot of ways. You get exposed to a lot more things. You're closer to being sort of that normal human experience.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you still have to be deeply, deeply driven. And I mean, those folks are always so interesting and inspiring to speak with.
Oh, I couldn't agree more, man. Yeah, I think it's it is really, really interesting when you see, and I know we're North America, we see a lot of US, comparisons to US and Canada, and just you say, those Canadian Olympic athletes, just the time, the energy, and the self-funding that they put into being the best in their sport or to get to that stage is unbelievable. You don't see often. It's getting a lot better, but I mean, years ago, I'm sure some of the Olympics you've gone to. I mean, I remember I lived in the States for quite a while, and I remember seeing commercials in Canada of our Olympic athletes working at Home Depot or being a waitress, and somebody sliding them a ticket. Hey, good luck in the Olympics. And then on the south of the border, you see them on the cover of Wheatie boxes, and they're, you know what I mean? It's so different on how they're funded and how they work and how they get to where they are. It's crazy.
Yeah, no, I mean, like there are stories of triumph and adversity in all international sport, right? Like that's the other thing, is it's not just Canadian athletes when you get to that stage. It's the greatest thing I've ever covered ever for any sport was in 2012 in London. An Irish boxer named Katie Taylor. It was the first time boxing had been a full medal sport at the Olympics, and this woman had been an elite level soccer player in Ireland, and she'd been a European and world champion. But again, like, she trained in a gym that didn't have a bathroom. So when she had to use the bathroom, and this sounds like an Irish cliche, it's not, she had to go to the pub down at the corner.
No way.
Right, to use the facility. And that's in a town called Bray, which is just a bit south of Dublin. And when she went to fight, this was 2012, she fought a Russian in the final, and I was there. Go figure, somebody named Fitz-Gerald pitching a story in an Irish boxer. But you go in, and it's in this giant convention center that's been converted into this boxing ring. So they trucked in 10,000 seats which are portable aluminum bleachers. Yeah. And, it's 2012. It's 4 years after the global economic collapse that hit Ireland especially hard. You remember the stories about the Celtic Tiger and this roaring economy that existed in Ireland. It was devastated. And it was still very much the case in 2012. So you had people like selling watches, pawn shops, to pay for the cheap airfare, but still to get over to watch this fight, because that's what it meant. RTE, which is Ireland's CBC, carried the fight live and broadcast it in parks. So, there were live shots of, throngs of thousands of people watching on basically drive-in movie theaters back in Ireland as this woman stepped into the ring. And you walk in and you sit down, and when she comes to you can still check it online too. When she starts walking towards the ring from her dressing room, it sounds like a tropical thunderstorm, just like, boom, 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 boom.
Cool.
And it's people jumping up and down and stamping on the aluminum bleachers. You can check it online. You still cannot hear the ring announcer announcing her name and the fight, because it is so loud in there. And when she won, it was like something had been released. Like, it was just jubilation. The venue was shared with wrestling and I think Taekwondo. So the idea is that after an event's over, you get the people out, you get them into the transport, you get them off the site, you get the next people in. But the Irish were having none of that. That they're just singing and happy, and they're in the hallway, and they're posing for pictures with the British cops, the bobbies with the big hats, taking the hats. I have pictures of them with Irish and various states of sobriety posing with these people. Like, it was just this moment of celebration, and that comes from one woman setting a goal for herself in a gym with no bathroom, minimal fanfare, day to day, to get to this global stage and triumphing when that moment came around. And that's just incredibly powerful for me.
Oh, that's amazing, man. Yeah, that's super cool. So that situations like that make for all the the dry times so much better, right? When you're struggling to find stories, you get a story like that, it kind of
well, I mean, the Olympics is, like, the Olympics is that drinking from a fire hose. Like, there are hundreds of those stories that happen every single day at the Olympics. I mean, there was one day I went to do a story about, this wasn't, maybe a day or two after the boxing. I think it was one of the first Olympics ever to feature, I'm going to get this wrong maybe, I think it was a target shooter from Saudi Arabia who was allowed to compete at the Olympics, and it was the first time. But she comes through the mix zone, which is this area after your competition where you meet with the media, and it goes TV, then radio, and then us great unwashed people who do print at the end. And by the time she got to the great unwashed, she was just so emotionally drained, she walked right past us. So you're at the Olympics, you need to produce a story. You're kind of like, well, oh shit, what am I going to write about now? The very next person who came through the mix zone, and I'd done a bit of research, so I knew a little bit, was a woman from Malaysia. And this is sharpshooting. So you have I think it's pistol. I think it was pistol. So you go in and you're basically shooting, high-level BB guns at a target. It's not exactly BB guns, but it's also not exactly a .22 caliber.
Yeah.
So, you have protective, gear and all that stuff. She comes through, and this woman from Malaysia was competing while 8.5 months pregnant.
No way.
So she'd been training for the Olympics, a physically demanding sport. You think about, the time, how much control you have to have of your body, all of these things for precise, like within millimeters of your target. And she was competing while 8.5 months pregnant. And she came through, and she didn't fare as well as she'd hoped, but she still made it to the goddamn Olympics.
That's
and
crazy.
Competed and showed as well as she could. And she got through to us, and it was me and a guy from the LA Times who just started chatting with her. And like, she was talking about how the president of Malaysia said that, go represent us well. If you go into labor in London, Malaysia will pay for all of your medical expenses to have your child in London. And this wonderful story about, having to do everything about learning and competing with a changing body, because your body goes through obvious changes, and just sort of the strength and determination that, she was still going to compete at the Olympics. And again, a much different kind of adversity, overcoming changes and requiring a lot of mental toughness and focus and bravery to go halfway across the world to compete in the Olympics, and just a great story. And it was just a Tuesday in London.
That's unreal, man. Yeah, that to me, that embodies mental toughness right there. Because like you said, all the stuff she had to overcome, not only just competing and training and being prepared and focused, but man, I have no idea what this is like, but you're carrying a child inside your body who's 8 months, like almost ready to come out. That's insane.
And you're one of the top few dozen people in the world who can do what you do.
Yeah.
Like, and she didn't reach the medal podium, but she competed at the best of her ability, and it was inspiring to see her come through and say, there was nothing that was going to stop me from reaching my goal of competing here in London.
And she's one of, how many in the entire world that can say, like, she was an Olympic athlete. That's, to me, whether you podium or not, medal or not, that is unbelievable to say, hey, we have a gentleman here who helps out with our athletes, and he was really good at track and field and got a scholarship and stuff, and was working in Calgary, and they asked him if he wanted to come try out for the bobsled team. He ended up making it as a runner, and ended up going to the Olympics. And, they didn't medal or anything, but same thing. Like, he's got a tattoo of the Olympic rings. I'm like, unbelievable, man. It's so awesome that you're, a part of that elite group of people that can say, I went to the Olympic Games. I was part of the Olympic Games. Like, it's unbelievable. So cool.
Yeah, it's just such an awe-inspiring time. And to go there as a journalist, you're there for 3.5, close to 4 weeks. And every day it's, you might sleep for 4 or 5 hours. you're going to drink, your body weight in coffee, and you're going, on media shuttles to the media center. You're going out to some far-flung place to cover shooting, and then you write that story in the morning, and you come back and you cover track or swimming or boxing or something at night, and then you go out and you have one to innumerable adult beverages at night, get to sleep, and then get up and do it the next morning, and you do it for 3 weeks. And when you come back, it even as a journalist, and we're generally as a species not known as being physical dynamos, but it takes a lot out of you, because like the emotional investment of looking at these folks and following these folks, and especially for athletes that you might have covered before who are from Canada, that the work, you've seen the pain, you've written about it, and to see it written across their faces in those moments is just so raw. Like there are athletes who this is their final Olympic Games, and maybe they achieve their goal and they're elated, and you feel, because you're right across the divider from them, you feel that, and you can't help but feel happy for them, sort of an elation by proxy. And then on the flip side, that you'll have athletes who might have just missed the podium by an inch in their final Olympic Games, and they're sitting there and they're deflated. They're a popped balloon on the floor beneath you, and you just want to. Sometimes, you're human. You want to just sort of pick them up and say, it's what you've just done is still remarkable. There was a triathlete in London, and she was a Canadian, and she was expected to finish, projected, I should say, in the top 3, maybe even be gold. But as there would be medical issues that would be found out later. She had an iron deficiency, and she just hit a wall, and she came across dead last. Like, other than the people who crashed on their bike, she came across dead last. But even then, she willed herself to keep going. So in the run, it's a kind of a crummy day in London. They're in Hyde Park. She kept pushing just so she'd finish the line, because she felt she owed that to herself, not just to herself, but to her family and to everybody who supported her. And she came across and she was just devastated, like openly weeping. And I think her quote is, "I'm sorry I let you down, Canada." And that's a powerful thing. Like, this woman just put herself on the line for years and years and years. And here she is apologizing, and she had nothing to apologize for, because the mere fact that, she didn't know what she was dealing with at the time, that she had that iron deficiency. But she still kept pushing through that wall, and it was incredible.
Yeah, it's
just, and you get that at the Olympics, and you get that at amateur sports in a way that you don't necessarily get in pro sports. Like, in pro sports, there's heartache and there's achievement, yes, and that's not to diminish anything that these women and men go through. But at the same time, that again, with all due respect, if you're playing for the Tampa Bay Lightning and you don't win the Stanley Cup last summer, well, that's awful. You're going to have to learn to sort of deal with that disappointment. But at the same time, you can go back and know that you still have 3 years and $9.6 million left on your contract.
Yeah, it's not a bad secondary prize right there, right? Like,
no.
Yeah.
Everybody suffers. It's the same in the pandemic, right? Like there are people who are really, really suffering, like real abject suffering and misery, economic, health, otherwise. But in a pandemic, it's all by stages, right? Like, everybody's suffering to a degree. So this isn't to diminish the suffering that you feel, but like, there's certain securities you have as a professional athlete that when you're coming off the high wire for the Olympics, you don't have, a guaranteed contract waiting for you back in Canada.
For sure. No, definitely. Yeah, there's no big safety net there when you're all done it, right? Definitely. Now, real quickly, because one thing I love to do, like, on this podcast is kind of, obviously every single hockey player will be a little biased here to hockey, but every single hockey player wants to play in the NHL, but we're probably not all going to be able to achieve that goal, or, that's not going to be all our paths. But for you, journalism, how did you get into journalism? And was it something that you were always kind of passionate about as a youngster? Because I think there's a lot of young hockey players out there that are going to become doctors and lawyers and teachers and plumbers, and which is awesome, right? And there's going to be some young players out there, male and female, that love writing and are really good at writing. But how did you get into it? And was it something you were always passionate about, or was it something that just kind of you fell into, or that you were just good at, or?
Too ugly for TV and too dumb to do anything meaningful.
Perfect. Done. There you go.
Bad at math. So it was either this or like sharpening pencils. And even then, like, I'm not really consistent. My consistency isn't there. No, I'm not kidding. I was terrible at science and math, as much as my everlasting shame. But I mean, my dad was a sports reporter.
Mm-hmm.
My great grandfather was sports editor of the Toronto Telegram, which eventually turned into the Toronto Sun after bankruptcy and reopening. And I'd always had that kind of curiosity. Now, I didn't necessarily always have a desire to get into sports. I mean, certainly it was there, and I did it through university. But I mean, my first full-time job in the business was being a news reporter, and I'd be, covering small town city hall can be just as fascinating as any sporting event because of everything at play and because
Sure.
real things happen, things that matter to people happen at City Hall. But yeah, so I got into journalism. I went to Ryerson. I did internships out in Kingston, the Toronto Star, the Hockey News, and then out of school. Because of some of that, I got lucky enough. The National Post had just started up about 18 months before, and I got an internship. And I guess they didn't feel like taking away my security pass for whatever reason, so I just sort of stuck around there for the better part of 15 years.
Wow.
And got to cover a bunch of things with great folks.
That's cool. That's really cool. Now, and this is one thing that goes, I think, by the wayside a lot with people that get into anything, whether it's, I think of most industries, especially back when you and I think, are right around the same age. So when we grew up, but you say internships. So internships, do they pay heavily? Because nowadays, when you talk to a young person about coming in and doing an internship or putting in a little bit of time to learn the trade or learn the business, right away they're like, well, "Where's my 50 grand? Like, I'm done university. I should be able to get, I should have a salary here of 50 to 100 grand." How many hours do you think that you put in on some of these internships for zero money or a negative on your bank statement?
None. None. And it's a really interesting conversation. I mean, I interned at the Hockey News, and they paid quite well.
Mm-hmm.
Internship at the Toronto Star, they paid at a union rate for a first-year reporter. I was very fortunate that ended up paying off my student debt. Interned at the Kingston Whig Standard for a summer. Again, they paid at a first-year reporter scale, which, I mean, I think it worked out to about $300 a week. So, you're not making rich, but again, it was enough to pay for rent while I'm in Kingston. The thing about unpaid labor, especially, I'm only going to focus on journalism, right?
Okay.
Because that's the field I know. The thing about unpaid labor and offering exposure, that's one thing. But if you're a site that's offering exposure, you're still getting something for nothing, like your exposure, whatever. Like if you pay attention to bylines, that's one thing, sure, and it provides people clippings. But what you're also doing systemically is limiting the number of people who can do the job. That, I mean, yes, it's great to say, yes, I volunteered and I didn't, in journalism, I didn't earn a thing for a year, and I worked 4 other jobs. But I got my clippings, which is what we call newspaper clippings back in the old days, and I was able to leverage that. Well, that's great. But what happens if you don't have the family support to help you pay your rent? Or what happens if you really just can't work 2 jobs full time? Because journalism, especially when you're coming up, tends to be a fairly involved profession where it's not 9 to 5. That if you have to work a full-time job or part-time job where you're in the service industry and you have to be at your service industry job at 7 p.m. and work there till 2, well, the thing about journalism is the story doesn't end at 6 p.m. Like you don't work 9 to 5, you don't work 10 to 6. It can go all night. So what you're doing there is you're limiting the pool who can access your industry. And you're making it, frankly, for people who come from a background of privilege. Now, again, I'm an old person. The industry was very different when I was coming up in, the turn of the century. Jesus, that makes me feel old. But generally, internships were paid. And this whole thing of writing for exposure hadn't been popularized. But even if it had, even if that was the only way, I might have been able to figure out a way to lean on my parents. But they weren't wealthy. They still had a mortgage. Frankly, they were going through a divorce at the time too. So I would have been real challenged to get into this business. And by demanding people work for free, you're limiting the number of people. On top of, some of these are big corporations with money that could well pay for an internship. You're taking advantage of the system. So I am very much against companies offering unpaid internships, especially for people who are just coming up. Pay for the labor. It's labor, pay for it.
Well, and I think, the big, and like you said, you weren't making a lot of money, and I'm sure you were working a lot of hours sometimes, chasing a story or putting a story together and things like that. You know what I mean? And what I'm getting at though is I think, if you want to get good at your profession, clearly you've done a good job of being a pro at your profession for over the years and the longevity that you've done it. I mean, there's got to be some work that's being put in there. I remember getting into hockey and hockey schools and things like that. I remember being, a youngster, like high school, going to university, and I remember, working for schools for free, and just to get experience. And
Right.
when I started owning my own school and running my own hockey school, I would always pay my young staff something. I would always give them, whether it was, and I was clear on what they were going to get, but they were going to get paid to work for me. And for the exact reasons that you said, I didn't think it was fair that now that I'm on the other side of it, looking at these hockey schools make money. That's why they run. And, they're not able to pay someone that's working pretty hard as a student who's, whether they're tying skates or running stuff over or jumping on the ice and helping out. So I never felt right with it. But at the same time, I do think there's something to be said about, people putting in a little bit of work and learning and, figuring it out and, not expecting to make, crazy salaries off the start and putting that time in to be able to kind of, hone their craft and get better at what they're doing and understand the ins and outs of what they're doing.
Well, the other trade-off is that in journalism, excuse me, you never get those crazy salaries.
Right. Right.
Journalism isn't a place. No, I mean, like journalism isn't a place where you're going to go make hedge fund money.
Yeah.
You can eventually make a comfortable living. I'm not here to say you can't. But like if you're working in a newspaper, you're working entry level. No, like you're not going to be driving a really great car. Frankly, maybe even being able to afford real estate in a lot of Canadian cities. It's something you do because you love it and you feel important or you feel a calling. But you're never gonna make, in year 5 enough money to overcome, volunteering for a year. Like you're going to be at a net loss if you do that. Yeah, it's just a thing. Like, and I'm not speaking for all professions because I obviously don't have a strong footing in that. But like, if you're asking somebody to put in a 10-hour day to, talk to people, chase people, interview them, write their thoughts down, and then formulate that into a story that's going to drive value to your publication, pay for their goddamn time.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair for sure. Yeah, definitely if they're adding that value, there's no doubt about it, right?
Yeah.
I want to get into your book in a sec, but the last thing, and this is more interesting to me, just in case I ever want to change gears and start writing, but what's it like as far as being a journalist? Like you talk about these kind of the media wash and kind of waiting for an athlete to come through. Is it really cutthroat when you've got 4 or 5 different journalists or 10 journalists? Is everyone pretty, friendly, or is it trying to not trying to get the inside scoop, but you kind of want something original, right? So you're going to have your own twist on it the way you write, and I would have my own twist on it the way I would write it. But is it cutthroat when you get to that? And, is it a pretty amicable environment overall?
It can be sort of an honor among thieves kind of approach sometimes, that it's very competitive. Information, stories, it's not something you're necessarily going to share freely with your competitor because you want people to read your work.
Yeah.
And if it's out there widely, then people are going to be less likely to read you. That being said, is it cutthroat? I mean, the industry itself is pretty cutthroat. I mean, sadly, we've seen that across all platforms. Newspaper, websites, more sad news apparently in the radio world today, television. There have been cutbacks, and some of those are pretty brutal. So, excuse me, among the journalists themselves, I mean, certainly up here in Canada and in Toronto, I mean, there's certain interpersonal rivalries, but I think generally, like nobody's going to push you out of a moving bus to get a story. There's a certain amount of professional respect that you'll come across, but like if player X tells me something, I'm not going to go and broadcast it to everybody in the press box before I write it.
For sure. No, definitely. Which totally makes sense. Now you're, professionally you're writing basically smaller scale stories, right? So a page, 2 pages, however long that is. What made you decide that, hey, I think I'm going to write a book? Because I've listened to a lot of stuff and I think anybody who's done anything is maybe even it's crossed their mind to like maybe write a book about a certain topic that you like or whatever, right? And maybe not everybody, but I know I've thought about it, never pursued it in 1 second. But That is a daunting task. I have no idea what it's about because I've never written a book. But what made you decide to do it? I guess number one, and was it more or less daunting than you thought it was going to be? Was it like how hard was it to write a book?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, I was unemployed, so anybody who wanted to talk to me, I was going to listen. So after I left the National Post, I left two times. Once I left for about 10 months and worked at the Canadian Press, and I got homesick and went back to the Post. And then 5 years after that, the Toronto Star was adding a lot of people and building this big charge to sort of beef up its newsroom. So I jumped to the Star. Unfortunately, about 10 months after that, they decided, we're going to take a scale back. And they laid off a bunch of people. And because I was one of the last ones in the door, I was one of the first ones out. So that weekend, as it turned out, I was playing shinny at Mattamy Athletic Center. So, the Maple Leaf Gardens?
Yeah.
I was playing shinny there on a Saturday. And I was playing, gloves, helmet, skates, stick, puck. That was it, just shinny. I just, because I'm me, must have caught an edge and just sort of fell on the blue line and landed on my elbow. It was like driving your elbow into a bowl of dried Cheerios. And you knew right away that my elbow was shattered. Oh. So I got up, had reconstructive elbow surgery in a Toronto hospital on Sunday, discharged home on Tuesday with a big vial full of painkillers. And home on Monday. And on Tuesday, the Toronto Star called to tell me I'd been laid off. For 3 weeks, I was sort of drifting along in a haze in the basement. And as I was coming out of it, I got a call from an editor at McClellan Stewart saying, hey, would you like to go for a beer? I'm like, well, I like beer. And two, you said you're going to buy one. So, yeah, I'll come to you for a beer. And, I'd known him for a long time. We'd worked together. And he just started talking conceptually about, you ever thought about, writing about hockey in Canada, just on a sort of a broader level. We got to talking more and maybe having one or two more adult beverages. And it sort of came into shape of, hockey and its relationship with Canada and the way Canadians relate to hockey is kind of changing. And what's the best way to explore that? And by the end of the night, we'd sort of hammered out a rough framework of this project that we could look at of, using, we used a proxy, so a town in Canada, any town Canada, Hockey Town Canada, and using that as a lens to explore some of the issues that are facing minor hockey in Canada as a whole. So we looked at, Halifax, Sidney Crosby, Nathan McKinnon. Do we go there? Do we go to Saskatoon, where the Blades have a deep history? Do we go to Trail, where the Trail Smoke Eaters have a big history? And we kept whittling it down, and ultimately we landed in Peterborough, which is home to the longest continuously operating franchise in the OHL, proud franchise that had been home to so many innovative thinkers that had been on the cutting edge a long time ago, that sent more players to the NHL than any junior team in history, but had also sort of fallen victim to some of the same thinking that had frankly hurt hockey across Canada, where the idea that it's cold, so we're going to open the arena doors and you're going to come inside and watch because it's Canada. What the fuck else are you going to do?
Yeah, totally.
And they hadn't changed that for a long, long time. They had new people and they had new ideas and they were looking to make change, but it was still new. So we landed on Peterborough, and I spent the better part of 3 years spending as much time as I could up there, learning about Peterborough, the Petes, and exploring some of the issues we knew about hockey in Canada, and looking at what it looked like through, the Petes, hockey in Peterborough, and hockey people in Peterborough.
So you ended up kind of falling around or kind of being with the Peterborough Petes for the better part of a year, correct? They kind of
for a full playoff run, a full season, and then a bit at the conclusion. So yeah, it was a season and a quarter, season and a half.
Was there any big eye-opening things for you being on the inside for that long? Because it's I've been on both sides as a player and then as a coach, and then so it was really, really revealing to me when I went from playing to coaching, and just I understood the game so much better. I wish I'd have known what the coaches knew when I played. It would have made my life, my career a lot smoother. But was there anything eye opening for you when you kind of got behind the scenes and kind of saw how it does operate behind the kind of away from the rink, behind the scenes?
This is going to sound silly, but honestly, for me, it was because you see the finished product on TV, you watch it from the stands. I mean, we all watch the World Juniors every year. But to go and to just, there's a hallway at the Peterborough Memorial Center where parents and partners and fans sort of hang out. Players will go either celebrate or get yelled at by their coach, shower, get ready, come out, and they're out in their suits and all that stuff, right? So that was one of my favorite places to sort of lurk after a game, because you hear, it's like being in any minor hockey rink. Parents still gossip about who got more ice time and who got screwed out of power play time and all that stuff, but also just gossiping among each other. The thing that really got me, which maybe I wasn't expecting, was that when these kids came out, and there's no media there, there's no attention there, there's no national stage or pressure there at that point, in that moment, in that hallway, because they're around their friends and family, is the realization that they're still kids, right? Like Nicky Robertson, who's now with the Leafs, he was 15 years old. And on the ice, he's still a small, slender guy, but he's got his shoulder pads on, his helmet, and he'll go and throw the body around. It'll be physical. But when he gets out with his mom and his dad, or like his tutors drove up from Michigan one day, like, he's just a kid. He's 15.
Yeah.
Right? Like, Cole Frazier was one of the scariest dudes in uniform. Like, he was old school hockey, right? Like, he had fists of thunder, and he just beat the hell out of people. And, even up in the press box, that Pete's people would say, "Uh-oh, somebody flipped the switch." And the thing is, when you flip the switch with Cole down on the ice, he wasn't able to flip it back. So, if you chirped him and you got under his skin, that next shift, he wasn't going to do anything other than hunt you down and, very likely beat the living shit out of you.
Yeah.
And take a penalty, maybe get suspended, maybe get kicked out. But in that hallway outside the dressing room, his parents would come, and he was a kid. He had 18, 19 years old, really soft features, gentle eyes when he was away from the ice. And, he'd joke and kind of blush when he'd admit that his girlfriend cut his hair in front of his buddies. You know what I mean? Like very different. So it gave me a different perspective of, even these kids are on the cusp of all the pressure we heap on them, of all the expectation that's on them, of the way we yell, fight, fight, fight from the stands, even in junior, although that's abating. They're just kids. And that was the thing that stuck with me most it just sort of stopped me in my tracks.
I think that is an unreal perspective. And I think more people, especially fans, should maybe experience that from a glass room, so they can't yell anything, but just watch that, because I think we do forget that. I get really irritated when I'm at a junior game and I hear fans yelling at these 16, 17, 18-year-old boys about play harder, why'd you miss that check, or you're a bum. And I'm like, man, this is someone's son, daughter, grandson. Like, these, to your point, these are just kids, man. They've never bought a house, they never bought a car, something, like, you know what I mean? A lot of them are they're just kids. Like, they're not even, they're not
never
even
filed taxes,
right.
Never voted, never.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's just,
and not only that, but sort of what we talked about earlier is the lifestyle they live. Like, this is going to sound like a generalization, and I guess it is, and it might not be fair, but I think more than a lot of other athletes, hockey players at the elite level are coddled a lot from a young
100%.
age. That from the time they're 12 and they're AAA, they're told that they're special, that, they're signed up for their tournaments. They have people who look after them, parents, coaches, or especially here in the GTHL, you have, these big, wealthy AAA organizations that take care of everything for you. You get to junior, and if you go to the O, then you have a bus driver, and you might have to carry your bags and stuff, but you never have to navigate necessarily paying your own rent or getting a job to pay for this stuff. And by the time you make it to the show, like, it's even the secondary point of this is that if you make it to the show or you make it to the OHL, statistically, there's a really good chance that you're from an urban area where your parents make a fair chunk of money. So, in terms of experiencing the world, their worldview can be pretty limited.
Yeah, well, I 100% agree. And I think a lot of them are in a bubble, right? They're in that hockey bubble where, they don't have a lot of, unfortunately, life. And my thing that I talk a lot about on this podcast, a lot of different guests, is I feel a lot of that comes from parenting, obviously. And that starts at 3, 4, younger, like, when they're young kids, and trying to get some of those values into them. And it is really hard, because I think for the parents that are going through it, and I know you're starting to go through it, and whether it's hockey or not, it doesn't matter. It could be school, it could be piano lessons or whatever. You feel like, maybe I have a kid who's really good at piano, and I've got 3 of his buddies that are really good at piano, and they're all taking these piano lessons with this really good piano teacher. And like, oh man, I got to go to that piano teacher, because so you get caught up in this vacuum oh my, I got to keep up. They're doing this. They're going to this spring tournament. They're going here, and I think as parents, sometimes we got to step away and be like, no, we're not going to that spring tournament. We're going to the cottage and see grandma and grandpa, or we're, you know what I mean? And I think those are hard decisions to make. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not I'm not saying that those are easy choices, but it's also something that, it starts at young ages to define your children not as just a hockey player, because you saw it, I'm sure, when you were there, and even right now, that some of these young kids at 9, 10, 11, they're defined as hockey players already. That's their
Yeah.
whole life. You talk to their mother about the weather, and 3 seconds later, you're talking about the new stick he just got and what skates he's wearing. It's like, we were just talking about the sun, and we were going to go, you know what I mean? So it's just, everything comes back to that. And I think that's part of the problem, is just, yeah, trying to create more well-rounded young human beings rather than just a piano player, just a hockey player.
Yeah. And that's the thing, like that's part of this whole thing that, Dr. Stephen Norris in Calgary has talked about a lot, that, this early streaming of kids, that it's not necessarily identifying who's going to be the best player in the long run, because we are talking about kids this young. It's who picked it up first. It's who's the kid who learned how to skate before their peers. It's who might have shot up a little bit in terms of size before their peers. And because we're doing it at such young ages, that hockey sort of eats its own young, right? That a kid who might be really, really fast at 12 might be just as fast at 16. But the kid that we all overlooked because, maybe he was still kind of an ankle burner back then, might be 6'3", 240, and had they stayed in hockey and not been chased away, could be just this unreal athlete. So that early identification, which can lead into what we're talking about, but also, part of the broader problem of chasing away good talent and forcing people out of the game, it's a real issue.
Oh, I totally agree. And I think, the one thing that I always come back to with parents, and you've heard of the boat. Like, I don't know what boat it is, but everyone's missing the boat, right? And I always say there's no boat. Like, if your kid is, I started late. I started at 9 years old, and it was back in the day, which a lot of kids started younger. But I had parents that were very. My dad was every year, do you want to play hockey? Do you want to play hockey? No, I don't want to play. No, I don't want to play. And then finally one year I moved into our neighborhood. A bunch of other kids played road hockey. We got into it. I'm like, Dad, I think I want to play hockey. So at 9 years old, I could hardly skate. I was terrible. But I loved the game when I started to learn how to play and how to skate. So I was way behind. Like, these kids were playing from 3, 4 years old. They were way better than I was. And
yeah.
But I caught up. The only reason why I caught up is because I was a little bit older. I was probably more developed brain wise and athletically at 9 than I was at 3, obviously. So, and I loved it, and I kind of closed that gap a little bit, and then ended up going on and playing a little bit. But I think the biggest thing for parents is just relax. Like, to your point, if just relax, just enjoy it. Just if your kid loves it, then let them drive that bus a little bit. Let them if they want to go play on the outdoor rink, or they want to go play road hockey, no problem, but let them kind of find their way. And I think exposing them to different things is huge as far as different sports and stuff like that. But any of the good players that we've worked with over the years that have been real elite and had that opportunity to play in the NHL or in the OHL, for the most part, they've been good athletes. They've been kids that hunted, fished, played soccer, played baseball, like did other things. You know what I mean? They were pretty well rounded for the most part, and they were athletic. And, and then they with athleticism, with other sports, you're going to be able to adapt to different situations on the ice. And I think but a lot of them, their parents, they were intense, and they were into it for sure, but they allowed their kids to do other things and try their things and experience other sports and stuff like that,
Yeah. No, I mean, that's the argument too against single sport specialization is just so huge that, Ray Ferraro from TSN tells great stories about how, when he was growing up in BC, that at the end of hockey season, he'd throw his bag in the basement, and that's where he left his baseball glove and bat the previous fall, and he'd pick up the baseball glove and bat, go out and play baseball all summer, and not really look at the gear. I don't know if that's as possible anymore, just because of the landscape. But it's a great idea to not forget that focus. You might have to do a couple of hockey camps. There might be team activities now, but to also not forget the importance of going out and playing soccer, joining a soccer team, of keeping up with rep baseball, of doing other things, going swimming. To keep that focus on hockey year round is a real issue, not just physically, because it leaves kids more open to repetitive injuries. You read about stories about goalies now, 14-year-old goalies already burning through their hips because they've been going down on the butterfly 1,000 times a day, 52 days a week. But it's also, the emotional and the intellectual and the psychological of, going to the rink, from a young age. If it starts feeling like a job, it's going to be a job. And if it doesn't turn out for you, that's going to be one of the first things you quit, because it's not fun. And if somebody tells you you're not going to go to the show and it becomes evident you're not going to go anywhere, then you're going to give it up. And that's not necessarily what you want, especially at these really young ages.
Oh, yeah, totally. Now you've got two young children, and already I'm going to assume as I've gone through, but you kind of are already starting to figure out what they really like and what they don't really like. And I know one of the ways that I know what they like is because they do it on their own. I don't ask them to go, color. I don't ask them to go read a book. They just do it because they enjoy doing it, or go outside and play basketball. They're doing it because they're enjoying it. So to your point, like, kids are going to kind of get, I guess, a little bit, if there's too much pressure added to it, or there's too much of mom and dad dictating what you're doing and we're going here, we're going there, I think you're going to turn a lot of kids off, or they're going to get fed up with it, or they're going to get tired or burned out. But if they're the ones that want to do it and the ones that are motivated, I think you're going to have, those kids. And I think, you mentioned this a lot in a lot of your stuff, and you have to have fun. It's got to be fun. If your job wasn't fun, I think you would have probably changed, industries a long time ago. Same here. If I didn't enjoy what I did, I probably wouldn't be still doing what I'm doing, So I think for young kids, it's got to be fun. The game's got to be fun. The experience of going to the rink and putting on gear and being around your buddies, it's got to be fun. There can't be pressure and, getting mad at a kid because he didn't play well. I suck at work sometimes. I don't have my dad coming down and yelling at me after a day at work. You know what I mean? So I think it's got to be fun for these kids, right?
No, and that's the thing. Like, for kids who aren't AAA, or kids who, aren't going, the fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percent who are going to actually do something with the game. If you chase them away, that's hockey's loss, right? Like, the idea is you want to make it fun. You want this to be a game. It should never be a job, because what hockey does, I mean, we know about it, right? Like, Tom Cochran sang about hockey, and Rock Carrier wrote about hockey, and, hockey was on our $5 bill for a long time. Like, it's so much about who we used to identify as Canadians, that, it's the benefits of community. It's the benefits of, feeling a part of something. It's the benefits of, developing physical literacy and physical fitness and all of these things. And what we're doing, in a way, is kind of throwing it away at a young age. We're saying, these families and these kids are part of something, part of a community. They're being active. They're not on the screens. They're doing all of this stuff. But at the same time, we're saying, well, we're going to start sending indirect messages to these kids that, yeah, you know what, you're not going to the O's. So, if you want to keep playing, sure, fine, whatever. But you just can't do it on our team or in this system. You're not AAA. You're not this. So they're going to go away. And whether or not they find another sport, who knows? But why are you just throwing that away? Why are you reducing your participation base at that young age? And I'm not talking, 16, 17, 18, for sure, right? Like, but if you think about other sports, like, if you're playing basketball, nobody's telling you before high school that you're washed up, right?
Yeah.
Like, you're not, if you're going to be football, by the time you get to grade 10, nobody's saying you're washed up. You're still growing. You can still lift. You can still add muscle. You can do all this. So why do we do it at hockey? Why are we doing it at hockey by, grade 7, saying you're never going to be something, so maybe go do something else? The skating component, yes, it's different games, yes, and it's getting faster and more skilled and more dynamic every day. Yes, I get that. But why are we streaming them out so early?
And who do you think, who's weeding them out so early? Do you think it's
systemic?
Yeah. No, yeah, it's society. It's, and I'm not blaming parents, but it's parents, it's coaches. It's that whole, this kid's not good enough. He gets cut. And then, it's basically, he's in maybe an indirect message, but you're not good enough to play at this level.
Yep.
And so it kind of gets weeded out.
Yeah, no, like that's the thing, is that, I mean, you've seen it because you work with kids, that, I mean, it's not like people are going out and saying, okay, we're going to cut as many kids out of the sport as possible. But like, kids are smart, that if you at, 7, 8, 9, 10, start identifying kids and start building towards things like the brick tournament or whatever, that you're sending messages to certain kids and other messages to other kids. And to the kids who are early adopters or who show a lot of early promise, you're going to, lots of positive reinforcement. You can move on. For folks who are left behind, maybe they're not going to get access to those skills coaches. Maybe they're not, going to get access to these other activities or these ways that maybe could enrich them or incentivize them to keep playing or just, reinforce that fun. It's kind of a catch-22 because those kids who are put into all these different activities, that's where we start talking about making it feel like work. But that's a coaching approach, I think. But the kids who are told, okay, well, this isn't for you, it really does take a certain level of internal motivation for the kids at that point to keep pushing on, as opposed to being said, oh, hey, come on over here, try this, join this spring team, do this, do that. They have to have that motivation themselves to push on because they're not being told that this is something for them to move into.
No, I definitely agree with that. Now, how did you come up with the title of your book? Because it's always something that's.
I wish I did. It was an editor at the publishing, McCall & Stewart. I couldn't come up with one to save my life.
Yeah.
I honestly couldn't. So before the lights go out, jokingly for a while, because Friday Night Lights is such I don't want to say template, but it definitely inspired some of the approaches. The Pete's play on Thursday night. So, jokingly for a while, it was Thursday Night Lights.
Yeah.
That obviously wasn't going to work as a title. So no, somebody at McClellan Stewart came up with that one.
Because, when I was looking this stuff up and that, and I saw, Before Lights Go Out, I was like, it's got, when you really think about it, it's like, oh, wow, are we, how far down the hill have we gone? Can we go back up the hill? And I guess in your opinion, after doing this for so long and kind of being entrenched in researching this, how far down the hill are we? And if you look back at maybe when you were young and I was young, I think, and even the last 10, 15 years, we were kind of top of the hill. We played hockey in Canada because you're Canadian, because that's what you did. That was part of what you did. And then over the last years, and you bring up some really good points about new, basically new people coming to Canada that are finding out the sports. The cost of the sport is obviously probably one of the biggest deterrents for some families, right? You can get soccer cleats and a ball way cheaper than you can get a full set of gear and ice time, right? So, those are a lot of the things that obviously have come in and played a big role in why the game's, declining and membership's declining a little bit. But how far down that hill do you think we are? Like, do you think it is something that we can turn around a little bit or even plateau and kind of sustain?
Yeah, it depends almost on the mood of the day, right? Like some days you feel, oh yeah, what this initiative is really, really good, and it's gonna, turn things around and open up the doors and welcome people in and make them feel welcome in the arena and reduce some of the barriers of cost and time commitment. And then, you realize the reality that, even here in a pandemic, when things are shut down, that there's still families holding super secret skills training sessions on outdoor rinks at farms outside of the city.
100%.
And you're like, well, never going to beat that out of
them. Yeah. It's so true. We were just talking about this the other day. There's some in London as well. We're a bit of a hockey, crazy city as well. And yeah, there's people posting posts about working with other players on outdoor rinks. And to me, it's just even the perception of the whole thing. Like, first of all, what are you doing? We're supposed to be staying at home. We're trying to get this thing past us so we can move on and open up restaurants and hair salons and ice arenas and all that stuff. And so I think you're right. I think it's almost a way of life for some people, and it's really, really hard to change that mentality. To get.
Well, it's the money in the system, right? Like, it's how do you create meaningful programming for people who who want to play but maybe don't want to take that crazy step. Crazy is not the right word, but the bonkers step of making it sort of a total life commitment. That house league at its base might not be quite enough because you get 1.5 hours a week, so you get a game. Maybe you get a game every week and a practice every other week. So 1.5 hours a week, that's a piano lesson, right? Like, maybe you want something a little bit more than that. Maybe you want a couple of house league practices or a couple of house league games, but you're not quite prepared to go, full where, you're playing on a house league team and a select team and a spring team, and you're doing skill sessions before school so that you have, a house league game and a half practice every week. And then you have a select game and maybe 2 or 3 practices a week. And then before, you're going to a skating treadmill on a Saturday morning and you're doing all that other stuff. Maybe there's somewhere in between. If that's the answer, how do you create, provide, and execute that programming with, something we haven't even got into, which is, the volunteer problem, where a lot of these places, volunteers have been the same ones who have been putting on the program for decades and decades, and they can't get new people out to the boards, right? So how do you implement all of these great new ideas with a volunteerism problem? So, I mean, what we've laid out here is it's a lot of problems and not a lot of solutions. And unfortunately, that's part of the book too, that, there is a lot of challenges. I mean, there's some solutions, but I think to your point that, are we too far down the hill? I would say no. And I would say the reason for optimism is that, folks at the OMHA, folks at the OHF, two of the governing bodies here in Ontario, and certainly in Hockey Canada, everybody's aware that these challenges exist and where the stress points are. The challenge is going to be developing solutions and implementing them, because a challenge that can be met in London, Ontario, isn't necessarily going to be the same as one in Halifax. Isn't going to be the same as one in Victoria. So how do you do that? How do you fix a problem as big as hockey in as big and broad a country as Canada?
No, I totally agree. Now, one thing, and I know you're I know you've got other things going on, and I really appreciate your time, but if you had to tell kind of parents, and I guess, after being in the trenches for, you've been in the trenches longer than a lot of us as far as doing research on this, and I know you're in the trenches every day as a parent and a hockey dad, but what kind of advice would you give to parents as far as just with this whole, let's say two sets of parents, so the new parents of the game, would you give any advice to them on how to get into it, or how to kind of approach the game, or how to get, your son or daughter even starting out with the game?
Yeah, it's tough, and I don't want to sound like I'm speaking from a high horse here, because, I mean, to be perfectly clear, I'm also part of the problem for all of this, right? Like I have put, my 8 and 9-year-old son on a skating treadmill. I have sent him to week-long hockey camps for March break, Christmas break, and a week in August. I have put him in, house league, select, and all of those other things before school skates. And frankly, my daughter, who's 6, she's going to learn to play. But if she shows that she enjoys it and she wants to do more of it, I'll probably do the same. So I'm not blaming parents here. It's part of the system. And I don't think, back in the old days, the cliche was, oh, you think your kid's going to make it to the NHL. Like, my kids inherited my hands. Like these are not the hands of a sniper, right? Like I know there's going to be limitations here. They're not going to make it to the show, but it's a fear of missing out, which I think we talked about earlier, that, you don't want your kid to feel left behind. You don't want to, because you wear your heart on your sleeve when you have kids, and you don't want to see them at 8 have to explain why they didn't make that team. If you can have it in your power to give them all the opportunities to keep up with their peers, then you will. But what you're doing is you're feeding into a system that excludes a lot more people too. And that's sort of the broader problem that we're talking about. And I guess one of the broader problems.
No, for sure. And yeah. And I guess in your research and going through the, kind of developing and going through your ideas and stuff, is there any kind of thing that popped off as far as this, we could start doing this that would help make it an easier entry point for people? Like, I know there's, the Bauer First Shift, there's the Canadian Tire, they got some good things out there that parents can go and find some funding and find some free resources or some inexpensive resources to get started and try the game out. But is there anything else that you've come up with or that you've seen that might work in different areas, just as far as making it an easy entry point for families?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky because, those are great programs. First Shift, the NHLPA has a really good one called Goals and Dreams, where, they'll go out and, they'll provide equipment. The Toronto Maple Leafs MLSE here in Toronto has gone and, it'll pick a minor hockey association and give every kid signed up for first year entry level programming free gear, like pants, pads, all that stuff. But it's a scale issue, that what we're talking about is so much bigger than these programs, that, you can't scale up these programs and have expertise in all of these different communities. So, the Maple Leafs can have a really good idea to give out free gear, but if they give them out in a community where so many of the families can already afford free gear, and in fact pull up in Range Rovers to the rink anyway, sure. They'll take that gear, sure, but it could go to better places. So I think the issue is that, Hockey Canada, the big top marquee stakeholders, the people who govern this game, certainly have a big responsibility, but the implementation and the change always has to come from the grassroots, because nobody knows the community the hockey players, the stakeholders in the community, more than those volunteers who come into the rink at 6 o'clock on a Saturday morning in February to put up the foam dividers so that the cross-ice kids can go.
Yeah.
You have to find a way to support the people at the local level. And the challenge, as we talked about a minute ago, is that, some of those folks, they could be your local bus drivers, your local lawyers, your local doctors, your local butcher, baker, candlestick maker. They've very likely been doing this for a very long time and aren't working with a huge base of volunteers. And none of those volunteers might have expertise in reaching out to other communities or finding ways to create business partnerships with local sporting goods, providers. So I think that, a good start would be, at the top, where all the money and the power is really sitting down and finding a way of saying, okay, individually, how can we download while also supporting people at the grassroots level?
No, that's a good point, because that is the key to hockey surviving in any country, any community, anywhere, right? Just those young players and families getting into it and having a good experience, obviously, and enjoying it, and then sticking with it for sure. So in closing here, are we okay? Like, is hockey going to survive, or are we going to lose the game? Like, what's going on here? Come on, give it to me straight.
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? Like, I think that, unless a meaningful change is enacted, and, hockey does a better job of removing some of those barriers. So not just economic, but sort of what we're talking about, right? That you make it more accessible and more welcoming for people who already aren't in your arena. So that's one. Two, you have to improve retention and make it fun. More kids are dropping out of hockey than signing up. So you have to broaden your tent, and you have to make sure the kids who are already there stay there. Because if you don't, and if current trends sort of prevail, and the roads to success are paved by people who come from a position of privilege, generally speaking. It sounds like hyperbole, it sounds like I'm being dramatic, it might be a bit of both, but hockey could become like Canadian polo, right? It's only for certain people with certain needs. And it's not only that, it's not seen as attractive, that there are other sports you can do. You can frankly not play any sports. You can play esports now. You can play basketball, or you can play soccer year round, because, even small Canadian towns now have soccer domes, which was, unheard of not all that long ago. There's a whole bunch of things you can do. You don't have to do hockey in Canada anymore.
Yeah, no, it's a good point for sure. And it's something that, we've got to work, like you said, at the grassroots level and up to, if we're going to keep this going and obviously make some changes. And as well as I do, and I'm sure when you were there, it's hard to change the mindset and hard to change the old, kind of the old school thinking of, hockey. And, even when this cross ice came about and actually was implemented, which I think was great, it was unbelievable, the uproar and how crazy it was. That's not how we played. We played on the big nets. We played full ice, and it was nuts, So any kind of change is going to be tough, but it'll happen. And even with the cross ice, I think a lot of people have adopted it and actually like it and see the benefits of it, which is great. So hopefully we can make some headway this way. But I really appreciate your time, man. This was awesome, Sean. And congrats on the book. I know that was probably, I guess, maybe a bit of a male way of giving birth as far as being done with it and being like, oh man, finally this is finished.
It was a heck of a thing, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's great. But thank you very much, and best of luck with everything. That was awesome.
Thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
All right. Well, we'll be in touch for sure. I could talk to you for hours about this kind of stuff, because it's always fun to get in the weeds on stuff like this. So I really appreciate your time.
There's a story breaking. I got to hop on, or else I'd be happy to stay. But I got to jump.
Got to pay the bills, buddy. You got to pay the bills.
Absolutely.
All right.
All right. Be in touch. Absolutely. Anytime.
Take care, buddy. All right.
Thank you very much. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye. To kind of raise that bar.
That extra gear, the first 3 steps.
Huge strides in the performance.
That I might not be the player I am today.